Women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there is something they want to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Given the fact that it seems to contradict what he's just said, given the fact that it's a very un-Pauline assertion, don't you think there's some reason to think that maybe Paul actually didn't write these words?
Got a good one for you today. So we're going to see Alex O'Connor pressing Stuart and Cliffe Knechtle on sexism and the Bible. Now, in this discussion, there are two key things he brings up. The first is about whether the Bible is actually sexist. And the second is about whether the Apostle Paul actually wrote the entirety of the letter of 1 Corinthians. So we're going to see how they have this discussion. I'm going to give some biblical commentary throughout. Let's dive in.
Context. Worship services have denigrated into shouting matches, into total chaos. Why? Women are abusing the new freedom that they have, and Paul says, stop it. Also, women are trying to teach and they've not gotten an education, which is tragic because they weren't allowed to go to school. But women who have an education are to teach. That's why Priscilla taught the great preacher, Apollos. So it's fascinating that Paul also writes there, right there in 1 Corinthians, when women pray and prophesy, they're to have their heads covered. Well, what's the matter with you, Paul? Are you schizophrenic? Don't you remember what you just said? Are you contradicting yourself? No, he's not. He's addressing two different situations, I believe, there. Chaos in worship. And as a pastor, I have to be careful that our worship services don't deteriorate into chaos, because we have some very emotionally charged people who can just rip the shreds out of a worship service with chaos and disorder. And so, no, you're not going to speak at this time because of order. But then women were allowed to pray and prophesy.
But before raising objections, I don't know, Stuart, if you agree with that analysis, if you have anything to add.
No, that's where my mind goes. Not directly related to this passage, but we have, at minimum one, maybe two, fascinating discourse between two ancient Roman emperors talking about a Christian disciple who's a female, and mathetes in the Greek is teacher. And so they are scoffing over this discourse of theirs, that we have this ancient manuscript, saying, can you believe that Christians actually have females teaching? And so whether that is discordant and contradictory to what's going on here, I don't think so. I would add another interpretation of women should remain silent. As you probably know, contextually speaking, even with other civilizations, if you were to remain silent in a service like that, it meant you already knew what was being taught.
Okay, so Cliff is right in that we need to understand the context of a passage, but we need to make sure that we understand the context and also the cause of what's being said. What we can often do, and what many progressive Christians do, and I think Cliff is at danger of doing it here as well, is talking about wider context that isn't actually directly relevant to that specific passage. To know what is relevant to that specific passage, we need to look at the context that Paul gives us around that passage. Let me show you what I mean. So in this case, Paul doesn't say that the reason women are to stay silent in church is because they're not educated. And Cliff also pointed out that there were educated women. He doesn't say, let the educated women speak. He doesn't say that. So the idea that the education status of the women is what's in view here is something that you're projecting, you're bringing onto the text. That's a form of eisegesis, not exegesis. Eisegesis means to add meaning to the text. Exegesis means to bring meaning out of the text. What we do see here in the context is Paul dealing with orderly worship. And the Corinthian church, New Testament churches had a very different style of church to the traditional formats that we have now. Our church services, you have typically one man at the front who's preaching, and you've got some people maybe leading in song, and it's a very structured, almost school-like church experience. And that's not what the early Christians had. The early Christians, their worship gatherings, you see them, Paul is saying, when you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue. So the early church experience was collaborative worship, was different people bringing their gifts, much more free-flowing, much more spontaneous, much more heartfelt, much more spirit-filled, and something I really want us to work towards creating in our day and age. And so he's talking about order in that collaborative style of church. And then coming down, so he just before he talks about women being silent in verse 34, he's talking about what to do when there are multiple prophecies. So he says, if any speak in a tongue, let there be 2 or 3 at most, each in turn. If there's no one to interpret, stay silent. Cool. Then he says, let 2 or 3 prophets speak. So 2 or 3 prophets speaking, not everybody prophesying, but 2 or 3 speaking. And then he says, if a revelation is made, let the first be silent, for you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all may be encouraged. So the prophecy, now we're coming to talk about prophecy, one person prophesy at a time. And then he says, let the spirit of the prophets be subject, or the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. But notice he says, when the prophets speak, let the others weigh what is said. So the specific context here is about discerning prophecy. It's discerning people who have said they've had a revelation from God, discerning the prophecy that they're giving to make sure that they're prophesying truth. And then he says, as in all the churches, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not submitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. So the context here is about discerning prophecy. And so he's saying that the women should not be speaking to discern prophecy, that they should be silent, because discerning prophecy is a form of spiritual authority. This is like what Paul talks about in 1 Timothy 2, where he says that a man is called to have spiritual authority, not a woman. And that's why he says if there's anything they desire to learn regarding those prophecies, they should ask their husbands at home. So as Cliff said, it doesn't mean that women should be completely silent, mute like a mouse in church, because in 1 Corinthians 11, he talks about women prophesying in church, and you have to prophesy by speaking. So even though the inclusion of women in the corporate worship would have been so scandalous to many people of that time, there still is a need for spiritual authority to be reserved to spiritually qualified men, and that women are to be in submission to that authority. And many people might say this is sexist. Like, why does God say women can't do something that men can do? The reality is there are loads of things that men can do that women can't do, and women can do that men can't do. It doesn't mean that there's sexism. Men cannot give birth. Doesn't matter what our current culture tells you, men cannot give birth. I've never heard anybody say that it's sexist that men are not allowed to give birth, because we recognize that we are made differently. The problem with our culture is that we view what's right and what's wrong from our perspective. But if you view what's right and what's wrong from God's perspective as the creator, you would see that if God decides, I want men to bear my image in this way, and I want women to bear my image in that way, and this is how they're going to bear my image. Men will do certain things, women will do certain things. And we don't use our gifts for dominance. So men don't use their spiritual authority for dominance any more than women should use their ability to give birth for pride and for evil and for dominance. We use the gifts that God has given us independently as men or women to bring him glory, to serve each other. So there's no sexism in that. It's us accepting, graciously and gratefully accepting the positions God has given us in this world and using them for his glory. So that's my take. But now we're going to jump back into the discussion to hear how Alex O'Connor addresses that passage. And it's going to really blow your mind. I'm going to respond at the end.
If we're talking about 1 Timothy 2:12, I think that this interpretation works very well. It's all about context. In fact, just to read that verse, because it's actually very similar. 1 Timothy 2:12, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, and so on and so forth. So women shouldn't speak in churches, this kind of thing. Now, there's so much about that verse, which I think you can apply this kind of sort of critical scholarship to. The word for authority. I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. It's almost like the authority and the teaching sort of go together. It's almost like by teaching, assume authority, and particularly authority that they don't have. In fact, the word that Paul uses there in the Greek, I think it's authentine, I don't know how to pronounce it, authentine, is this word for authority, which in other contexts tends to mean seizing authority that you don't have, that you shouldn't have. And in fact, Paul uses a different word to say authority elsewhere. So there's something very particular going on here. Women shouldn't speak or assume authority over men, rather they should remain silent. That is, women shouldn't take authority that they don't have and speak with that kind of thing, right? So something a bit like what you're saying there. And also there's this idea that there were sort of these cults of feminine divinity that were cropping up, like the cult of Artemis, which had, these women preachers. And it may be that Paul is writing to Ephesus here. He's writing to a specific church, and he's saying, okay, these women are taking authority that they don't have to speak with knowledge that they don't have, that they think they have, and they shouldn't do that. They should be quiet, right? Fine. That's Timothy. the problem with the quote from 1 Corinthians is that women should be silent in churches. Firstly, we don't have the same thing with like the authority and whatnot. It just says women should be silent in churches. They're not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. So now a reference to their subordination under law, which doesn't arise in Timothy. Also, if there is something they want to learn, let them ask their husbands at home. If this was just a case of these incredibly knowledgeable women who were sort of speaking too much, or maybe they had to remain silent because they already knew what they were talking about, why would Paul say, if they have a question, they should go and ask their husbands at home? Like, it seems like a much more troublesome verse, for it is shameful for women to speak in church. Like, my solution to this, I don't think Paul wrote these words, especially given that, like you say, just a moment ago, Paul has said that women should cover their hair when they prophesy. Firstly, it's not necessarily the case. I suppose you could prophesy outside of a church, right? Like, it's not necessarily a contradiction. You could say, like, somebody's prophesying out on the street, and if you're going to do that, cover your hair. Right? That it doesn't say. I don't think Paul would be contradicting himself just to say that women shouldn't speak in church. Because when he says that women should cover their hair, it's specifically when they prophesy. It's not when they speak in church. It's when they prophesy, right? But it does seem like maybe he's being a bit contradictory here. Also, he's referencing the law. They should be in submission, as the law also says, which is a very like un-Pauline thing to do. Paul is all about like Christ and grace, and the law is something, and yet here this appeal is being made to the law. So he seems to contradict himself, and he also seems to make a very un-Pauline, assertion. But also, this is the only verse in any of Paul's letters which, in our earliest manuscripts, moves around in the manuscript. Sometimes it's up here, sometimes it's down here, in the earliest manuscripts. And so it's this weird thing where, and also if you read the text, Paul is talking about, like, Paul is speaking to the Corinthians about Corinthian matters, and he's talking about other stuff. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, is this verse. Women should be silent in the churches, if they've got anything to ask, they should go and ask it at home. And then it's right back to talking about to the Corinthians on a completely different subject matter. So it seems to me that Paul didn't write these words. These words found their way into Paul's letter, even though he never actually wrote them. And there's some interesting scholarship to suggest that that might be the case. What seems to have possibly happened here is that a scribe who's copying out Paul's letter sees him talking about like women prophesying and all of this kind of stuff. And so he writes in the margin his own note, like, yeah, but women should remain silent. It's a disgrace, they should go home and ask their husbands. And as these manuscripts get copied, it finds its way into the text, which is not an uncommon thing in the ancient world for that kind of thing to happen, for something to find its way into the text like that. That would also explain why it moves around. It would also explain why it contradicts something he said a moment ago. It would also explain why it's not very Pauline. And the funny thing is, he's probably saying that because he's read it in Timothy, even though arguably Paul didn't write the entire letter of Timothy, right? And so, in other words, my solution to this, my salvation of Paul here, is just to say, well, he didn't write those words. And interestingly, that allows me to absolve Paul. I'm able to say, no, Paul is this radical feminist. He gives women more rights than anyone else in the world, but at the cost of undermining our belief in the scriptural legitimacy. I mean, given the fact that this verse moves around, and it's the only one that does so, given the fact that it seems to contradict what he's just said, given the fact that it's a very un-Pauline assertion, don't you think there's some reason to think that maybe Paul actually didn't write these words?
It's a very difficult question you're raising, and I appreciate it. But I like what Mark Twain said. Mark Twain said, it's not the parts of the Bible I don't understand that disturb me. It's the parts of the Bible that I do understand that disturb me. And to be honest with you, I have a harder time with 1 Timothy 2 that you said did not present as big a problem to you. But when you read that kind of literature, you begin to understand some things are going on here that I'm not sure I understand. For instance, at the end of 1 Timothy 2, he says, women will be saved through childbearing.
Yeah, right.
Oh my goodness, what are you telling me, Paul? That women are going to be saved by having babies? No. But obviously Gnosticism taught the physical, bringing children into the world is dirty and inferior. And I think the Bible clearly teaches, no, the body is a beautiful gift from God. So don't trivialize childbearing and think it's wrong. Also, when he says Adam was formed first,
yes,
who gives a rip? Unless you're dealing with pantheism, which says Mother Earth, that's what's really significant. And if you're battling in Ephesus pantheism that says we worship planet Earth, we worship nature, and you're saying, oh, no, we don't worship nature, we worship the God who created nature. That's very similar to the first commandment. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery, out of the land of Egypt. You're to have no other gods before me. Well, why is he so fascinated about no other gods before me? Because of polytheism. And I think Moses is pointing out to the Jewish people, we are not polytheists. We don't believe in many gods dancing on the clouds. We believe in one creator of heaven and earth. So I think understanding the culture that is being addressed by these authors is very important, be it Paul in 1 Corinthians, Paul in 1 Timothy 2, or a lot of the Old Testament.
Or indeed whoever it was that actually wrote the book of Timothy.
Well, Alex is clearly interested in textual criticism. So there are 3 reasons that he suggests that that passage was not actually written by the Apostle Paul and essentially was inserted by somebody else, and by implication has caused so much unnecessary and unhelpful deception in the church down the line. And Cliffe and Stuart, clearly it's not a perspective that they'd considered before. And so I understand them not necessarily responding directly. But let's examine what Alex said. So firstly, his first reason is that the passage shifts, or that it's in a random location in the text. Now, we've already seen that it's not random, because Paul is dealing with order in worship. And he's talking about discerning prophecy and talking about what women are to do when prophecy is being discerned. So the place is not random. Secondly, he says that it's inconsistent with Paul's view of women. And in fact, Alex O'Connor describes Paul as a feminist. I can assure you, Paul is not a feminist. Paul values women. Paul sees women as also made in the image of God. But the difference with feminists is that feminists want to destroy any distinction between men and women. Essentially, a feminist would say, whatever a man can do, a woman can do. And Paul would say, men and women do what God has called us to do. That's why Paul earlier in 1 Corinthians 11 is able to talk about men and women and head coverings. And he doesn't tell the men to cover their head. He tells women to cover their heads. Now, I believe this passage about head coverings was contextual for that time, because Paul says in verse 14 that nature itself teaches you about a man's hair and a woman's hair. I think that's him appealing to what they would have experienced culturally at the time. There's no Old Testament scripture that says a woman has to cover her hair. But there are scriptures that talk about men being the head of their wives, men being called to places of spiritual authority. The whole of the Old Testament, the prophets, the priests, the kings, were positions that were filled by men. Alex also mentioned the law says this. He appealed to the law. And he's like, Paul is all about Christ. He's not about the law. No. Paul was about the law. He said in 1 Timothy 1:8, the law is good if you use it lawfully. He spends so much time in the book of Romans talking about how the law sets us up to see our Savior. He also talks about how in 1 Corinthians, things that were written down to people beforehand were written down for our good, talking about the Old Testament. He said in 2 Timothy 3, all scripture is God-breathed. So Paul, it's not inconsistent for Paul to appeal to the law when talking to Christians. And finally, Alex essentially says like he's saving Paul by presenting him as this feminist, but Paul doesn't need saving. If we look at the scriptures and it seems to challenge our perception of what is right and wrong, the Christian humbles himself to say, God, your word is true. The testimony of the Lord is sure. So if I see the scriptures and it seems to be telling me something that I think is wrong, out of the two of us, it's not the scriptures that need to change. It's not the word of God that needs to change. It's not Paul that needs to be saved from appearing sexist. It's me that needs to be sanctified to see things the way that God calls me to see them. We need to get away from this idea that any distinction between men and women and any distinction in our roles must be sexist. We see it every single day. Your mom's not your dad. Your dad's not your mom. Like we know this. There are different things that we're called to do, and let's use our gifts for the glory of God. If you enjoyed this video, check out this one. I know it will bless you. I'll see you there. Peace and blessings.